None of these debates is remotely new. In 1917, more than 100 years ago, substantial opposition in the US to Woodrow Wilson's desire to involve the US in World War I, which came primarily but not exclusively from the left, resulted in the enactment of repressive laws such as the Espionage Act of 1917, still used today as the law of choice to prosecute whistleblowers such as Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, and also resulted in the mass prosecution of war opponents such as the anti-war socialist Eugene Debs. That's because Woodrow Wilson regarded anti-war opposition and dissent as a serious threat. Similar opposition coalesced in response to Franklin Roosevelt's obvious desire to involve the US in World War II, opposition which that time came mostly, though not exclusively, from the American right. In both cases, the sentiment driving war opposition was the argument that the US has no valid business risking the lives of its citizens and its treasure for wars on the other side of the world that did not directly involve threats to the borders of the United States. That's why Pearl Harbor was necessary to convince so many Americans to support World War II, because at least there was now a plausible case that that war could find its way to US shores. But even with Pearl Harbor, the reasons for the US entering either of those world wars was far from obvious for many millions of Americans who quite reasonably, even if you don't agree with them, believed in the principle that the US should not interfere in other countries' wars, much less their internal affairs, unless doing so is directly necessary to preserve the security of American citizens. But with the US riding high on the intoxicating scent of victory in those two world wars, it adopted a posture of endless war almost immediately following the end of World War II. That's when the US security state, and then the CIA and the NSA was created. The National Security Act of 1947, implemented just 2 years after the end of World War II, radically transformed the nature of the US government. It created a permanent war, an intelligence and security bureaucracy that by design operated entirely in the dark, outside of the structures of democratic accountability and transparency, and as many predicted, at the time of its enactment, it eventually, indeed quite quickly, ended up being used not only to interfere in the internal affairs of dozens of other countries simultaneously, but was also turned inward on the American people, where it remains today. The president who oversaw the massive growth of the secret security state was the hero of World War II, the five-star general Dwight Eisenhower. Elected in 1952, Eisenhower was certainly no pacifist. He believed in the need for the US to maintain the most powerful and expensive military in the world. Yet he frequently attempted, often without success, to at least try to slow down the uncontrolled explosion of military spending and to impose some safeguards and oversight on the explosion in secret, clandestine, covert intelligence operations, much of which was often kept from him, he angrily learned afterward. So after spending 2 years as president, 8 full years, Eisenhower delivered his primetime farewell address to the nation in 1961. He was not a man of many words, and he did not have much time. His speech was less than 10 minutes in length. But he decided to use that small amount of time to warn Americans of the grave threats to their democracy, to Americans' national identity as a republic, and to the prospect of enduring peace posed by what he now famously called, quote, the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex. Many people are aware of this term and its origins, but it also is nonetheless really worthwhile to listen again to the crux of Eisenhower's warnings. And when doing so, think about how it applies to contemporary debates over what role the US should have, if any, in the domestic political conflicts of foreign governments on the other side of the world.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Now note that clip, while emphasizing the likelihood that this military-industrial complex may lead to war, also emphasized the harms posed to American citizens domestically. And while that clip is reasonably well known, indeed, when I posted that speech excerpt on Twitter in 2020, it was notably retweeted by then President Trump for reasons I'll discuss in a minute. There's a second less known excerpt from Eisenhower's speech about the urgent need to prioritize respectful dialogue over power-driven conflict and interference in U.S. foreign policy.
Imperative. Together we must learn how to compose differences, not with arms, but with intellect and decent purpose. Because this need is so sharp and apparent, I confess that I lay down my official responsibilities in this field with a definite sense of disappointment. As one who has witnessed the horror and the lingering sadness of war, as one who knows that another war could utterly destroy this civilization, which has been so slowly and painfully built over thousands of years, I wish I could say tonight that a lasting peace is in sight. Happily, I can say that war has been avoided. Steady progress toward our ultimate goal has been made, but so much remains to be done. As a private citizen, I shall never cease to do what little I can to help the world advance along that road.
Now, just one note about that clip. As you listen to that, just imagine how Eisenhower would have reacted to the reality over the last 9 months that anyone who proposed diplomacy as a way to try to end the extraordinarily dangerous war between Russia and Ukraine, with the US acting as proxy partner, would be castigated as some sort of traitor. Diplomacy in order to avoid war was what Eisenhower wanted most.